Hi, I'm Igor Smirnov from the Remote Chess Academy. In this lesson, we will talk about a very interesting topic. It's how can you become a great attacker? In the previous lessons, Trifon has showed you all the typical attacking patterns. Along with that, you have seen phenomenal chess games of the past with the most brilliant examples of the attack. So first of all, I would like to thank Trifon for his great presentation. He is a true king crusher, and we can learn a lot from him. In this lesson, I would love to come a little bit closer to the practice, to blitz games, to short games, to the games where you need to be able to find great attacking moves, where you don't really have time for thinking and you have to come up with the best decisions while spending only a few seconds per every move. Once again, I'm enjoying watching the games of phenomenal players of the past, but the only drawback is that we don't know exactly how they managed to find those good moves. And some people would say that the guys like Paul Morphy or Fischer, they are God-gifted and that's how they managed to play such brilliant chess. Therefore, for this lesson, I have selected my own games and even blitz games. I'm not a legendary or genius person, and therefore you can be sure that if I am able to apply these rules in my games, you can do just the same. Moreover, since these are blitz games, you can be sure that these principles are highly practicable and therefore they don't require very deep thinking or calculation of tons of variations or things like that. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. We'll start the training of how you can find right attacking moves in your practical games. Here's the first example. I'm playing black. The white player is with the nickname Dukac. And this is a 3-minute blitz game. Currently it is black to move, so please think about this for a second. How would you play here as black? We can see that the black's queen is attacked. And it has to go somewhere. So the real question is, where should the queen go? There are plenty of options and you may expect that black needs to calculate all of those lines and compare which one is the best. However, there is a much easier solution and it's one of the greatest chess rules that you may ever see while playing chess or learning chess. So here it is. You should focus your attention on opponent's half of the board and try to play there as deeply as possible. So those moves are the most powerful. This is contrary to what most players do while playing chess. They just, normally how they find moves, they look at the pieces that they have and start thinking where they can move. And I'm suggesting you an opposite approach. Instead of looking at your territory and your pieces and thinking what they can do, instead you focus your attention on opponent's territory and think how can you invade there. And if you follow this principle, you can easily see that there are only a few available moves forward that the queen may make, and the most forward one is the move queen to d3. So this move should be played. Again, as you can see, no need for any calculation or any real comparison of various opportunities. You just know this general idea to go as forward as possible and you follow it. Now white replied with queen to a4, attacking the pawn on a7. How would you play here as black? I hope now you already got the point. You need to focus attention on white's half of the board and think about which attacking moves can you play there, which attacking and forcing moves. The forcing moves are checks, captures, and attacking moves. In this position, black has a few possible captures like queen takes f1 or knight f3 with check, but they don't make any sense, so they just lose the material for nothing if you would consider moves like that. And therefore, there is only one attacking move on white's half of the board which does make sense, and it's the move pawn to h4, attacking the knight. The knight went back to h1, and again, if you compare all of the opportunities that black has, there is only one normal attacking move, and it's the move pawn to h3, which does create a threat. So again, you try to play your pieces and pawns on opponent's half of the board and make a forcing move. White replied with knight to g3, like took with the pawn. Now king takes the pawn. Okay, now let's think about this position. How do you think, which moves do you need to consider here? Well, obviously black would prefer to continue his attack against white's king. And there is a move, for example, like the move queen to h7. And probably it makes sense. In some situations, moves like that could work. But normally I would not recommend that you make moves backwards. In most of the cases, they are bad. Although there could be exceptions, of course, but in most of the cases, that's not the right way of thinking. And the right method is to focus attention on white's half of the board and consider forcing moves there. In terms of checks, there is a move rook takes h2, and you may consider it for a few seconds. Think if you can checkmate your opponent. Or we may make an attacking move with jumping one of your knights to g4. So I would prefer the knight from f6 because, again, we should try to move as forward as possible. And the e5 knight is more forward piece than the knight on f6, and therefore I would prefer to include the less active piece into the attack. And therefore in this position there are only two moves that you really need to consider: rook takes h2 or a knight to g4. Rook takes h2 is a little bit unclear, so black may continue his attack with a more simple move, knight to g4, with a straightforward idea, rook takes h2 on the next move. You can see how easy it is to find the right moves when you know this right way of thinking. White replied with h3, and here, what do you think? What should black play? Yeah, the way of thinking is still the same. You should be considering forcing moves, checks, captures on white's half of the board. So real quickly you need to consider check like this, and capture like rook takes h3, maybe knight takes f2, although in this position it doesn't make much sense. So moves like this you need to consider. But moves of the knight don't make much. It's the move knight takes f2 would even help white to include his rook in defense. However, the move rook takes h3 works perfectly. In case white accepts the sacrifice, it's just a forcing checkmate. Black may play queen h7 check, and then queen h2 with a quick checkmate, and therefore white may not really capture the rook. Let's go back to the real game. In the actual game, white played queen to b3 to try to kick off the black's queen, or at least exchange it. Which moves would you consider here as black? I hope that now you got the point that you need to start checking forcing moves first of all. And the forcing moves, the most forcing move is check. Which checks could black play here? There are a few possible checks with a queen, but they doesn't work really, because the queen will be lost without any compensation. And as for the rook moves, there is a move rook h2 check, which is a good one, and there is another one, rook takes g3, which you also need to think. Rook takes g3 does make some sense, because you eliminate the only defender around white's king, and moreover, after rook takes g3 and pawn takes, black may continue with queen to e2 check, and on the next move there is inevitable checkmate on h2, for example, king g1, queen h2, and that's a checkmate. Let me repeat once again the key concept. Instead of looking at your pieces and thinking where they should move, you may adopt the opposite approach. Focus your attention on opponent's half of the board and think how can you go there. Preferably, you want to make forcing moves. The most forcing moves is check, then capture, and lastly, a simple attacking move. If you just follow this simple rule, as you can see, it is possible to develop devastating attack with sacrifices without even calculating many variations or without considering too many options, and even with very limited amount of time that you have for thinking. Here is another example. Quite standard position out of the opening. Both opponents just has developed his pieces. Currently this is white to play. I'm playing white. The black player is with the nickname Amir80. This is a 3-minute blitz game. And let's just train your attacking skills once again. So please think about this. How would you play here if that is your move? There are a number of reasonable possibilities, like you can bring the rook into play, your least active piece, or you may bring out the queen closer to black's king side, maybe to h4 or to g3, to start aiming at opponent's king. King h1 is a typical prophylaxis in such positions, or you may push one of your pawns forward. So how do you think, which one is the best? Well, none of the moves that I highlighted with arrows, because as you know, the right approach for finding the good moves should be different. Instead, you need to focus your attention on opponent's half of the board and think, how can you play there and attack something? Usually, there are not that many opportunities of attacking moves on opponent's half of the board. Usually there is just one or a few possible moves. Like in this position, there is no significant attack that white may play, but there is a move f5 which may initiate some attack. That's why I played it. It's the move f5. Black captured the pawn, and now although black can grab the pawn, it will disrupt his pawn structure on the king side. Therefore, black decided to play g5 to keep the situation closed, to keep the position around his king closed. Here's again the question for you. How would you play here as white? You need to look at the forcing moves at opponent's half of the board. The most forcing moves are checks and captures. Obviously, there are no checks at this point, but there is a possibility of a capture. It's knight takes g5, which destroys the black's pawn cover. Then after pawn takes, I took with the bishop. And once again, it's not that I calculated all the lines here, and there are plenty of the moves possible. In this position, there are plenty of moves that black may play. Certainly, it's not that I calculated all of them in a blitz game. It's just the general guideline that I'm following to play forced moves on opponent's half of the board, and I know that if I follow this rule, things should work well. Okay, let's see what happened in the game. Black took, bishop takes d4 with check. King h1 is the move. Here black played f6 to close the position on the king side. How would you play here as white? Where would you move your bishop? Well, if you would need to move the bishop, you need to look at the forward moves, therefore the move bishop h6. However, as we know, first of all, you need to check checks and captures. And in terms of checks, which are the most forcing moves, there are only two options, which are queen to e6 or bishop to c4. So mainly these are the two moves that you need to think about, first of all, and then decide which one is better. Queen to e6 is an interesting move, but in this position I don't like it very much, because in the next move black can move the knight somewhere and the white's queen will be attacked. So I don't see the very good continuation of the white's attack here. Therefore, let's go back. And instead of queen e6, there is only one more check that white may play. It's bishop c4, and I played it. Black replied with d5. Perhaps he wanted to trade off some pieces. Now king to g7. Which move do you need to play here? Again, check. Well, I'm sorry for this phrase, but you need to check checks first. The only meaningful check is bishop to h6, because bishop takes f6. Also, you may have a look at this move for some time, but here it would only help black's pieces to come closer to his king. Therefore, bishop to h6 makes more sense. And then after king takes and queen h4 check, this is a forcing checkmate. With queen to g4 check, and now if king goes to h7 or h6, white may go queen g6 check, and then queen h6 checkmate. Once again, you can see that white managed to develop an attack with seemingly simple moves. I'm saying seemingly because if you would have a look at this game before, you would think that it's a very complicated game with lots of variations and lots of calculations and tactical motifs and so forth. But now when you know how I find those moves, you can see that it's really easy when you know the right principle. And by the way, these games are far from being ideal. It's neither black played perfectly, neither me. For example, in this position, if we take some moves back, after I sacrificed here, and this is just the starting position, after I sacrificed the knight here on g5, the computer here suggests that instead of bishop takes g5, it was much more powerful to push the pawn to f6, because in that way it prevents black from playing f6 himself, which closes the position on the king side. So if white would play f6, that would be the best move, which would win the game, while bishop g5 was not the best move. So I'm trying to highlight the fact that these games are not ideal, they are not played by genius players, but you can see what works in real practical games. So bishop g5 maybe was not the best move, but it was a good move. It was good enough to win this game and to get a good position at least. As a conclusion, while finding moves in the middle game stage of the game, you need to focus your attention on opponent's half of the board and think which attacking forcing moves can you play there. And the forcing moves are checks, captures, and simple attacking moves. If you follow this guideline, you'll be able to find attacking moves really easily because there are only a few options which would fall into this concept. Let me highlight the fact that I'm talking here about the middle game stage mainly, because if you're playing an opening stage, in the opening you need to develop all your pieces first of all, and that's the main task. So this idea of looking at the opponent's half of the board, it starts working after an opening when you already have your pieces in the game.